So apparently I got a cut off once again. So I think this is about where we left off. So this is part 3 of the Cold War, and we're almost done in only a couple more minutes. So in 1985, Ronald Reagan, in his State of the Union address, said that we must stand by all of our democratic allies and sort of renewed our efforts in the Cold War once again. And this became known as the Reagan Doctrine and included our invasion of Grenada in 1983, supporting the Contra rebels against communist Sandinistas. And we actually did this by sending and selling arms to Iran kind of illegally. So that was kind of crazy. And our support of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who were ultimately became the Taliban in their fight against the Soviet Union. Great film again. I think I mentioned this in the other one, is To See Charlie Wilson's War, which kind of lays out that history of how we supported the Taliban in the pre 9/11 era. And then in Africa and Angola, we supported anti-communist rebels there. Mostly we did this through selling of small arms. The president also proposed what he called strategic defense, or Star Wars, and we saw a big increase in our military budget at this time as well. Here you see the president inspecting troops. The gentleman down here with Ronald Reagan is Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. And he decided, under some international pressure, to introduce a policy of glasnost, which means cooling, and perestroika, which means sort of capitalism improvements and loosening of the economy within Russia. And the cooling part was cooling of relations with the United States. So in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to eliminate a lot of nuclear missiles. So we saw an actual arms reduction treaty. The Soviets then began to withdraw their support of Eastern European nations, and it's then that those Eastern European nations begin to sort of collapse one by one. We see East Germany fall, Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, they all become democratic nations. Ukraine. In 1989, the Berlin Wall actually falls and is torn down. And by 1991, there really is no Soviet Union anymore, and they're looking to create their own democracy. So I was in high school in 1989 when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and prior to that, it literally divided the city on east and west. And when you visit the city even today, you can still see the remnants of parts of the wall that they maintain for historical posterity purposes, but also then they have a brick pathway that goes along the whole city that denotes where it was. But the architecture was very distinct on the east side and the west side of the city. Architecture on the east side of Berlin is very communist, utilitarian, not very interesting in its architecture style, and West Berlin was much different. So here's another location where you can see the east and west wall. In most places, people were actually not able to approach the wall. There was a bit of a no man's land, and there were 2 walls that were built to keep people out. And there's a space of about 100 yards or a football field's length in most places where the wall existed. On the west side, people painted extensive graffiti and artwork on the wall itself. And on the east side, people were not permitted to actually go near it for fear that they would try to go over it. So here you have the events. People started to literally storm up and over the wall from both sides in 1989. And ultimately, civilians with sledgehammers got into the wall and managed to break down the concrete barriers. And here you can see the first slab coming down and some East German troops looking through the wall for the first time. At the same time, you have a lot of international sort of democratic movements in China. In 1989, you had a student movement where students were pushing for democratic reforms in China and started to occupy Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And this is the Forbidden City, which is the old, where the emperor would have lived in ancient China. And all of these students were calling for democratic reforms and more capitalistic reforms, and occupied Tiananmen Square for days. And finally, the government came in with tanks. This is that very famous photo of the tank man, a gentleman who stood right in front of the Chinese army, sort of protesting. He disappeared. He was escorted from behind the tanks and disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him. But thousands of Chinese were killed that day. And it is not a really known event in Chinese history. If you show kids your age pictures of Tiananmen Square, they don't even know about the event. The propaganda machine in China has done a lot to kind of wipe out this movement. And what China did instead, why we haven't seen more democratic movements in China itself, was that they started to loosen and create economic reform. So it gets to that question, does economic freedom result in personal freedom? And are you willing to have some personal freedoms taken away as long as you have economic freedom? And so far, that seems to be the case. There's a growing middle class in China, and there has been less concern by the general public about personal freedom, such as freedom of speech and to speak out against the government and those sorts of things. So the question is the mission accomplished? We still have a very chilly relationship with Vladimir Putin, who is a former KGB officer. He initially served as president and then reached a term limit and could no longer be president, so he got himself appointed prime minister and had his friend elected president. And then while his friend was in office, he made sure the constitution was changed and that he could run again. And so now here he is, president yet again. We don't know how long he'll be president. And as the Russians have set their sights on Ukraine and Crimea, they've cracked down on rebels in Chechnya and Georgia, former Soviet states of theirs. You see a lot of similar behaviors. So we ally ourselves with the Russians in some instances, like against Iran, and then in other instances we issue sanctions against them for their own behaviors. So the question really is, are we entering another phase of a similar Cold War? All right, there you have it.